Apache-Comanche War and the San Saba Presidio. Early in the 18th century, as fledgling U.S. colonies were still struggling under the yoke of British rule, the Comanche Empire was on the rise. During that time, Spain, hoping to solidify their foothold in the central United States, had built a number of missions and presidios stretching in a line all the way from Mexico City to Taos and Santa Fe in the northern part of New Mexico. Spanish governors worked with and fought against native tribes in the region, in particular the Apache and Comanche tribal networks throughout the 1700s, trying to provide safety for Spanish settlers in the region. During the early part of the 18th century, Comanche were able to displace many Apache settlements in New Mexico and northern Texas using superior military tactics and alliances with other tribal groups in northern Texas and New Mexico. The Comanche were so successful they were able to supplant the more agrarian Apache throughout the region, driving them south into central Texas. In the middle part of the 1700s, Spanish authorities, looking for a way to subdue Comanche raids and the tribe's growing dominance in the region, formed an uneasy alliance with the Lipan Apache. The Spanish hoped the Apache would settle west of the Balcones Fault region in central Texas. In the minds of the Spanish, the Apache would provide a buffer against marauding Comanche and their allies, the Tonkawa, Bitt, and Hassani tribes that occupied North Texas at the time. To achieve their goals, the Spanish surveyed the area north of San Antonio and decided to build a mission in current-day Menard County in Texas. The site seemed perfect to the Spanish at the time. There was a broad, fertile valley and surrounding hills. It's beautiful country. It was also on the border of what the Comanche had decided was their land. The choice of the location was a bad one for a couple of reasons. First, the Lipan Apache, who hated the Comanche and had already been driven from their tribal lands in northern New Mexico and Texas by Comanche, would use the location to stage raids into Comanche lands. The Spanish had built the Presidio and mission at San Saba to protect and at the request of the Lipan. The second reason was that the Comanche saw the mission as an alliance between two ostensible enemies. Or at least the Apache were regarded as enemies. The Comanche distrusted and feared the Spanish and, at least in part, wanted to trade with the Europeans. The Comanche, Tonkawa, and Hassani were so incensed by the Spanish mission at San Saba, or as it was also called, the Presidio San Luis de Amarilla, that they destroyed the place just a year after it was built. In 1758, a group of around 2,000 Comanche, Tonkawa, and Hassani attacked the mission and burned it to the ground. It should be noted that the Comanche raid lent credence to a suspicion the Spanish had regarding the Comanche and the French. The Comanche warriors, when they attacked the mission at San Saba, were reportedly armed with over 1,000 French rifles. It may be that the Comanche had ulterior motives for the raid. During their burning of the San Saba mission, the Comanche killed only 8 people. The death of 8 people is a tragedy, but the number, in my opinion and in the opinion of some historian, tells us something about the Comanche people. They weren't savages. They could have slaughtered a lot more people, but perhaps because they hoped to trade with the Spanish or simply didn't like to slaughter women and children, they only killed 8. I'll also note that the Comanche had good reason to be angry about the mission at San Saba. They had been at war with the Apache and Spanish for some time. Texas and Mexico at the time was a bewildering mix of shifting alliances between the Apache, the Tonkawa, the Hassani, and other tribal groups. The French and Spanish wanted Texas and New Mexico for themselves. The Comanche had a healthy respect for the Spanish. Spanish forces in New Mexico had defeated groups of Comanche warriors on 2 occasions earlier in the decade, first killing over 100 Comanche warriors in 1747 near the Chama River in northern New Mexico, and taking over 200 Comanche captive, mostly women and children. In the second battle in 1751, Spanish forces killed another 100 Comanche warriors and captured many others. The humiliating defeats forced the Comanche to sue for peace. Anger over those losses was surely still fresh in 1758. Following the destruction of San Saba, the Comanche would assert dominance in the region that would last for the next century. Getting back to my comment about the small number killed at San Saba, it could have been much worse. The Comanche didn't live up to their reputation as bloodthirsty savages with no regard for human life. They behaved in a more civil and reasoned way than they had been treated just a few years earlier by the Spanish. In 1761, the Spanish would once more show their heavy hand, and with the help of former Comanche allies, the Ute, slaughter over 400 Comanche women and children and take another 300 captive. After that, the Comanche would change their policies of appeasement. To be fair, the Spanish, who were in conflict with the French for control of the central part of the U.S. at the time, felt the Comanche were in league with the French. The entire situation must have been confusing on all sides, as no one had much in the way of intelligence regarding what the other side was actually thinking. On one day, the Comanche were killing Spanish, or the Spanish killing Comanche, and the next week, they were acting as trade partners. If we can glean anything from the confusing situation, it is that the Comanche were pragmatic and calculating in their ways, with sound leadership. They weren't the terrible savages they are sometimes made out to be. It is true that the Comanche could be brutal in their dealings with their enemies, but clearly they were responding in kind. They were no worse than the Europeans or the other tribes they struggled against to control the region. Perhaps the reason the Comanche are sometimes seen as more brutal isn't because they were more brutal, but rather because they ultimately came out on top. The Battle of San Saba is merely one of the more well-documented conflicts that shaped Comanche policy for the next century. The Comanche were smart, hard-working men and women who built an empire by fighting it out with people who were just as brutal as they were. There was a lot going on in the 1700s in central Texas and New Mexico, stuff that doesn't make it into high school classrooms or U.S. history textbooks. In my mind, Comancheria The dominance of the mounted armies of the Comanche in the 18th and 19th centuries on the central plains of Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and almost all of Texas remains one of the most fascinating stories of the Old West. That's it for today's Plate of History Beans. I'll have more on the conflict between the Comanche, the Apache, and the Spanish next week. We'll also see a little about a fourth party, the Americans. For a time, the Comanche would rule over them all as supreme lords of the plain. Now it's time for Chapter 37 of Hunting Charm, The Revenant Looks Back. Chapter 27, The Revenant Looks Back. Francois Martin waited for nightfall, watching through his spyglass from a thicket of oak brush 100 yards from Cecil and Brant's camp. He had been following them for several days, formulating a plan, practicing with his injured right hand. They would be in Fort Worth in a day or so. He had to make his move soon. He watched as Cecil Johnson doused the cooking fire. Francois allowed another hour to pass before edging his way to a small stand of brush 10 feet from their camp. If Francois had been less successful in the past, less capable in his chosen profession, he might have trusted his instincts. He might have returned to his family in Lafayette Parish, to his mansion alongside the Bayou Teche, to live out his days in comfort. Instead, the insistent finger, the voice in his head, urged him to do something he sensed would fail. "You gonna sit here all night?" the ghost's finger taunted. "Hush. The longer you wait, the more chance that cowboy senses you here. Go on. Do it now." He was upon Hunter Brantley in seconds and thrust his blade, aiming for a spot just beneath the rangy cowboy's left armpit. Things might have gone exactly as planned, but at the last second, Brantley turned, just as he had done the first time, almost as if he sensed the blade coming. Instead of penetrating the rib cage, Martin's knife struck bone. In the heated moment, Francois's brain tried, and in the past would have succeeded in pressing the blade home. Instead, when his once corporeal index finger reached for the knife's hilt, Francois found that a ghost bears no weight in a world of flesh and bone. An instant later, Hunter fired, and a .45 slug entered Francois Martin's gut. A second shot followed, and Francois felt himself drift to the ground. As he lay there, he recalled Louis Tremont, how quickly his former boss had died. He also thought for the dozenth time about Brantley's warning, about how losing something as small as a finger could change things immeasurably. A lucifer flared, and Cecil had his lamp going. Brant could see Francois crumpled less than 5 feet away. He stepped to the assassin's side and kicked the man's blade away. Kneeling, he quickly found and discarded a pistol and 2 other knives. "This fella, whoever he is, knew what he was doing," Cecil said. "You're lucky you didn't get that blade in deeper. How's your breathing?" I think I'm okay," Brant said. Cecil held his lantern near Hunter's side and pressed a handkerchief against his wound. "Hold that tight. Since you're still standing, that probably means he didn't get in there deep enough to matter." Cecil turned to examine Francois Martin. He pulled back the man's blood-soaked shirt, nodding his head. "How far you reckon it is to Fort Worth?" he asked. A day or two, Brant said. Do we want to keep this man alive? Brant paused, considering the question. Theo Tarwater still had Matt in his custody, even though Francois Martin had been there to kill them both. He couldn't simply risk Matt's life. We should probably see if we can get him into town, he said. Within 10 minutes, Cecil had their gear packed and Martin on a travois rigged from the tent. They rode through the night, the next day, and through a second night, nearly killing their mounts. They made Fort Worth at noon on the third day and immediately asked if the town had a doctor. 5 minutes later, they dismounted alongside a neatly framed house with a shingle that read Dr. Franklin Llewellyn. Brant hurried inside. There's a man outside needs attention. Brant grabbed the wall to avoid falling. 2 days on horseback, blood oozing from his side, had taken a toll. I'd say you're in need of attention, Dr. Llewellyn said. You should see the other guy. Come in here and sit. My nurse will look at you while I help your friend. Back on the street, Cecil considered the best way to transport Francois Martin inside. A handful of passers-by had gathered, but none of them offered to help. Instead, one of the men, a narrow-hipped cowboy with a smoldering cheroot hanging from his bottom lip, approached Cecil, glaring. Did you shoot this man? No, sir, I just brought him to the doctor. What happened, boy? Cecil looked at the pot-bellied cowboy for a long moment and fought the urge to tell the man to leave him be. I didn't shoot this man, he repeated. Get the sheriff if you like, but this man needs medical care. Cecil wrestled Francois Martin from the travois and began dragging him toward the door. The cowboy followed, barking questions. If you had nothing to do with this, why the hell are you bringing this man in here to the dock? Are you going to help or just act like an ass? Cecil blurted out the words before he could stop himself. You don't get to talk to me like that, uppity son of a bitch. The cowboy grabbed Cecil by the arm, and with a thud, Martin hit the ground. Donnie Penny, leave that man be, you idiot! A buckskin-clad woman with a voluminous head of red hair pushed the angry cowboy to one side. At that moment, Dr. Llewellyn appeared, and with Cecil's help, they pulled Martin up and continued inside. The conversation between the fiery redhead and the cowboy continued. Why do you have to act like an ignorant fool all the time? The woman said. Feller was being uppity. He wasn't being uppity. You were acting like a darn fool, which seems to be about all you're good for. Annie, now, that ain't fair. A man can't take another man into the doctor's office. Well, now, Annie, I reckon a man who's white can, but white? What does that have to do with it? Can you see that man is injured? Well, now, yes, and can you see the other man is trying to get him into the doctor's office? Well, now, Annie, the other man is well, he ain't a proper white man. Why are you so stupid? Oh, Annie, I ain't stupid. You're as stupid as a mule. Now, come on. The voices faded as they edged through the door into the doctor's home. They navigated Martin's limp body down the hallway and into the examination room. Charlotte, leave that for now. Remove these bandages while I prepare our surgical instruments. Llewellyn pointed to the strips of leather Cecil had used to bind Francois Martin's wounds, then hurried from the room. You're going to be okay, the nurse told Brant. Why don't you wait in the other room while we look at your friend? He ain't my friend, Brant said. Exhausted from the long ride, Brant and Cecil dozed in the waiting area as the doctor worked on Francois Martin. Brant awoke when the nurse reappeared and guided him back into the examination room. "The other man isn't doing well," she said. "Is he going to live?" Brant asked. "I doubt it." Dr. Llewellyn entered and began probing Brant's cut. "I spent nearly 4 years working in field hospitals during the Civil War," he said. "Your friend is going to die." "He ain't my friend." "Ah, yes, you mentioned that, didn't you? We don't refuse anyone treatment, but there is the matter of payment." "I have money," Brant said. "Or at least my partner has money." "And your partner is the colored man?" Llewellyn asked. "No, but he's here in town." "I have some money," Cecil said. "Cecil, I don't expect you to—" "How much you reckon this here gonna cost?" Cecil asked. "Well," the doctor considered the question, "I suspect $5 for the gentleman would be adequate, but the other man—" The doctor released a gust of air. "As I say, he will likely die, though it could take several days. Wounds to the gut are difficult to predict. Never mind for now. Let me look at this." Dr. Llewellyn inserted a flat steel instrument into Brant's knife wound. "Easy, Doc." "This may hurt a bit," the doctor continued probing, oblivious to Brant's complaints. For the next minute or so, the doctor poked and prodded, asking the nurse, who held a lamp, to focus the light several times. The physician sniffed at the wound and asked the nurse to do the same. She nodded negatively and handed the doctor a needle and thread. "Your wound is superficial, though it did penetrate the exterior oblique muscle, which means we must stitch. Another inch deeper and you could be dead or facing a severe infection. There may be some damage to the transverse abdominis, but again, not bad. I imagine this cut, because of its location, will be painful, but won't cause you any long-term problems. I'm going to clean with alcohol and then iodine. It's going to sting. Then I will stitch the wound closed. No riding or travel for at least a week. 2 weeks would be better." "I can't ride a horse for a week?" Brant asked. "I just got off a horse. I've been riding 2 days straight." "Yes, I understand, but riding could cause your stitches to tear. Should that happen, they will have to be redone. I can give you a mild opiate for the pain, and I'll see you again in 2 days. Let's discuss payment for the other gentleman." "He's an employee of Theo Tarwater. I reckon he has money of his own." "Is Theo Tarwater a relative of Miss Doreen Tarwater? I don't believe I've met Mr. Tarwater. At any rate, did you know your injured, the man you brought in is a U.S. Marshal?" What was that, Doc?" Brant asked. "Did you say he's a U.S. Marshal?" "He is carrying a badge which seems to be genuine," the doctor replied. "The man jumped me in the night. He sure as hell wasn't acting like any lawman I've ever met." "I've sent word to the sheriff's office. I suspect he will be arriving soon." "Cecil, go on now," Brant said. "I'll find you later." At that moment the door sprang open and there stood the bespectacled deputy. Brant expected him to draw his gun and arrest Cecil, but instead the man crossed to where Hunter sat at the end of the examining table and offered his hand. "Goddamn pleasure to meet you. I mean, it's damn good meeting you. I have the greatest respect for you and your partner. I read the book on how you two men saved them McGregor girls." The deputy seemed about to cry at the thought. "Fact is, you fellers is, well, as far as I'm concerned anyway, y'all is just dandy." "How the hell do you know who I am?" Well, your partner was in my office no more than an hour ago. I didn't rightly know who he was at the time, but I reckon some of the fellers he was traveling with got to talking with some of the folks outside. Told them how you were the fellers from the book about them McGregor girls. Poor lost souls. The deputy blinked his eyes, then removed his spectacles, wiping them on his shirt tail. Anyhow, boy from the saloon told me how the two of you were split up, and you were traveling with a colored man. This here's the colored feller, I reckon. The deputy pointed his thumb in Cecil's direction. Anyway, the man with the tar water, obnoxious bastard, pardon the language, miss, said how you shot one of them and how they didn't hold it against you one bit because you were only doing what you figured was right. So you're just assuming we're those men from the books? Brant asked. Well, ain't you? Brant weighed his options, then said, Yes, sir, I am Hunter Brantley, but we ain't here to cause problems. Well, sir, the deputy nodded slightly. Your word is gold in my estimation. Still, I must take this one to the jail for the time being. The deputy gestured toward Cecil. Another man done accused him of raping a white woman. Wouldn't be the first time some buck got himself in trouble lusting after a white girl. And it wouldn't be the first time some white man got a black man hanged for no good reason, Brant said. Well, now, fair enough, the deputy said. I reckon I'm gonna let that go for now. Still, I can't just let a man walk free with an accusation like that floating around. Then there's the matter of a U.S. Marshal. Doc here says this man was carrying a badge. Honestly, I should probably put you in jail too, but... The deputy sighed. I believe a man of your standing deserves special consideration. Brant took a deep breath, wishing Matt was there to handle the finer points of the conversation. I appreciate it, deputy. Now, you mustn't leave town, the deputy said. He needs bed rest for at least a week. The doctor looked sternly at Brant. I have yet to close your wound, but if you won't rest, then I might just as well leave the thing to get infected. Well, that's just dandy then, the deputy said. What would you say to little Pharaoh later? They usually have a game going over at the hotel in the evenings. Brant looked back and forth at the deputy, the doctor, and Cecil Johnson, uncertain how to respond. Finally, he turned to Cecil. Maybe jail would be the safest place for now. Truth is, I don't know what other choice we have. Yes, Cecil knew fleeing would be tantamount to an admission of guilt, one that would likely get him lynched. We're not going to just leave you there, Cecil. Brant turned to the deputy. This man is innocent. There are men in town who would see him lynched, so I'm counting on you to keep him safe. Can you do that? Anyone who comes into my office trying to molest or otherwise circumvent the law will find themselves at the wrong end of a double-barrel 12-gauge, the deputy said, then awkwardly saluted. Thank you. Brant turned to the doctor. Doc, I have one piece of business I need to check on before I get in bed for a week. Is there any way we could hold off on the stitching until, well, maybe tomorrow or this evening? The doctor looked at Brant, pursing his lips. You understand, I can't be responsible for infection. Yes, sir. Well, we could pack the wound with bandages, soaking them in iodine to protect you, but it won't be comfortable. I could give you something for the pain. Not right now. The wound, located as it is, will continue to bleed without stitches. Losing too much blood could cause other complications. Even with the packing, the bleeding will continue. I thought that by wrapping it up, that would make things... Yes, the wrapping will help, but I suspect you've already lost some blood, though it's hard to say how much. If you feel faint, you should stop and rest, the nurse said. Is this deal going to kill me? Brant asked. Oh, I don't imagine so. You look fine now, the doctor said. I suppose you could pass out. Dear, what if we used one of my corsets? Brant realized the nurse was also Dr. Llewellyn's wife. For what purpose? To stabilize the wound, Mrs. Llewellyn said. Ah, okay. Well, I think that might work. The doctor nodded. Now what? A corset? For me? Brant looked back and forth at the doctor and his wife. Yes, the doctor's wife said. As I said, without stitches, this will continue to bleed. A corset will stabilize those muscles and should help the wound close. This is interesting. Mrs. Llewellyn left the room while the doctor shouted after her. I wonder if this might be a new therapy heretofore overlooked. A way of binding wounds without stitching. It could be revolutionary. A moment later, Mrs. Llewellyn returned with an impressive-looking garment replete with lacing, bone stays, and embroidered curlicues. My dear, should we give him this one? The doctor looked fondly at the rather naughty-looking bustier. Hush, Mrs. Llewellyn said. Is that thing going to fit around me? Brant looked at the garment doubtfully. Let's see. The doctor held the corset up to Brant for size. We will need to let it out, but yes, I think so. They spent the next few minutes loosening the laces, testing, and adjusting the fit. Mrs. Llewellyn packed iodine-soaked bandages into the cut. Finally, they wrapped the corset in place and began tightening the laces. Dang. Oh, does it have to be so dang? Dang, I can't breathe. It has to be tight, the doctor said. Otherwise, it won't do the job. This is for your own safety. I know it feels like you can't breathe, the doctor's wife added. Just take shallow breaths. You'll be fine. But, how? God damn it! Now, you can't tell me ladies wear this tight. Ow! I have almost have it. The doctor gave the laces one last pull and then secured them with a knot. Excellent idea, dear, Llewellyn said. I may write an article about this for the medical journal. I think you should, dear. Yeah, Brant groaned. You should definitely write an article. What if I get blood on the lady's corset? Oh, well, we will naturally have to add the cost of the garment to your bill. Oh, yeah, naturally. Brant dressed gingerly. He had to admit that the corset did make him look and feel a little slimmer. Nevertheless, the tight bodice restricted not only his breathing, but oddly seemed to make it harder to walk. As Brant left the office, the doctor pointed to the west. Straight out that way, and you'll see a laid stone house atop a hill on your right. Follow that road up the hill, and that is where you will find Miss Tarwater.